Liberalism. Liberalism is one of the most popular political and moral ideologies founded on individual rights, liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, the right to private property, and equality under the law. As the name suggests, liberalism supports liberal ideas that in many cases can sound anti-government and pro-people. It is often regarded as the leading ideology of the 20th century. Liberalism originated as a separate movement in the Age of Enlightenment, gaining appeal among Western philosophers and economists. At its core, liberalism aspired to replace inherited privilege, state religion, absolute monarchy, monarch's divine right, and conventional conservatism with representative democracy, the rule of law, and legal equality. Liberals also abolished mercantilist practices, royal monopolies, and other commercial impediments, favoring free trade and marketization. The American Civil War substantially quickened the trajectory of liberalism. In the 19th century, English liberal and political theorists dominated the global liberalism tradition. Liberalism molded periods of reform in the Islamic nations, such as the rise of secularism, constitutionalism, and nationalism, as well as various intellectuals and religious groups and movements, such as the Young Ottomans and Islamic modernism in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East during the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, reformist ideas and tendencies did not reach the general public successfully, since books, magazines, and newspapers were largely available to intellectuals and portions of the expanding middle class. Many Muslims regarded them as alien influences in the Muslim world. This eventually led to Islamic revivalism. At the start of World War II, the world's democracies were roughly the same as they had been 40 years earlier. After 1945, liberal democracies flourished rapidly but then withdrew. Larry Diamond, an American scholar and sociologist, explains that by 1974, dictatorship, not democracy, was the way of the world, and that barely a quarter of independent states chose their governments through competitive, free, and fair elections. Diamond claims that democracy recovered and that by 1995, the globe was predominantly democratic. Liberalism continues to confront difficulties in many countries, particularly given China's extraordinary rise as an example of authoritarian rule and economic liberalism. The concept also rose to prominence in Iran during the 20th century. However, a coup ended the dominance of liberalism in the nation's politics. Throughout history, numerous ideological groupings have criticized and supported liberalism. Conservatives, for example, have criticized what they see as liberals' irresponsible pursuit of development and monetary advantages, claiming that such preoccupations undercut traditional social ideals based on community and continuity. The Roman Catholic Church was one of the most prominent early critics of liberalism, sparking protracted power conflicts between national governments and the Church. Liberals sought and constructed a constitutional system that valued key individual liberties such as free speech and association, an independent judiciary and public trial by jury, and the removal of aristocratic privileges. Later waves of modern liberal ideology and struggle were significantly shaped by the desire to increase civil rights. Liberals have fought for gender and racial equality in their efforts to advance civil rights, and worldwide civil rights movements in the 20th century accomplished significant aims toward both goals. Conservatism. Conservatism is a cultural, social, and political ideology dedicated to promoting and preserving old institutions, practices, and values. Conservatism's core values may change depending on the society and civilization in which it occurs, but at its core, it wants to conserve the customs and traditional ways. Conservatives, depending on the nation, in Western culture support a variety of institutions, including the nuclear family, organized religion, the military, the nation-state, property rights, the rule of law, aristocracy, and monarchy. Conservatives often embrace institutions and behaviors that promote social order and historical continuity. Edmund Burke, an 18th century Anglo-Irish statesman who opposed the French Revolution but backed the American Revolution, is regarded as one of the ancestors of conservative thinking in the 1790s, alongside Savoyard statesman Joseph de Maistre. The term was first used in a political context by François-René de Chateaubriand in 1818 during the Bourbon Restoration, which aimed to reverse the French Revolution's programs and restore social order. Conservatism can be distinguished from liberalism and radicalism based on their belief that human beings cannot be ethically transformed via political and social reform. They strongly believe that traditional methods stay intact as they work, instead of reforming the political and social concepts based on the changing needs. As a result, conservatives believe that established political and cultural institutions may help to control people's basic and harmful inclinations. families, churches, and schools must teach the value of self-discipline, and those who fail to learn this lesson will face government and legal sanctions. Conservatives think that without the restraints of such institutions, there can be no ethical behavior or responsible use of liberty. Because of its Middle Ages heritage, the Roman Catholic Church has attracted the most conservatives of any faith. The Allied triumph in World War I brought down 4 great imperial dynasties, those of Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Ottoman Turkey, which were the last major bastions of conservatism based on monarchy, landed nobility, and an established church. In modern politics, conservatism can be widely recognized in many countries. Chinese conservatism may be traced back to Confucius, whose ideology is founded on the principles of loyalty, responsibility, and respect. He believed in a hierarchically ordered society based on the patriarchal family and guided by an absolute ruler. Modern Chinese conservatism prioritizes the preservation of traditional culture. Socialism. Socialism is an economic and political system based on the common ownership of the means of production. In a truly socialist economy, the collective makes all production and distribution choices, which are overseen by a central planner or government authority. However, worker cooperatives are another example of socialized production. The key socialist concepts include production for use, not for profit, a fair allocation of material resources and riches to all individuals, no more market competition in purchasing and selling, free access to products and services. Socialist societies often feature comprehensive welfare systems and social safety nets, so individuals rely on the state for everything from food to healthcare. The government sets the output and price levels for various commodities and services. Socialists argue that shared resource ownership and central planning lead to a more fair distribution of commodities and services and a more just society. Common ownership under socialism can take several forms, including technocratic, oligarchic, dictatorial, democratic, and even volunteer governance. The former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, usually known as the Soviet Union, is a notable historical example of a socialist country, although one led by communists. Because of its practical difficulties and poor track record, socialism is frequently referred to be a utopian or post-scarcity system, while current supporters think it may work if properly implemented. They claim that socialism promotes equality and security. A worker's value is determined by the length of time they labor, not the value of what they produce, whereas capitalism exploits workers for the benefit of the affluent. Socialism, as a system of shared resources and community production, has been practiced since the dawn of human civilization. Tribal or clan-based communities frequently collaborated for the common benefit, providing adequate food and resources for the entire population. Modern socialism, on the other hand, emerged as a reaction to the excesses and abuses of liberal individualism and capitalism. In a socialist economy, governmental authorities known as central planners can regulate the behavior of producers, consumers, savers, borrowers, and investors by taking over and controlling trade, capital flows, and other resources. The market becomes controlled, involuntary in many cases. In an ideal free market economy, trading is voluntary or unregulated. That is not to say that socialism is a scourge on society. Social welfare programs like food stamps, unemployment compensation, and housing aid might be classified as socialist. It may be claimed that government programs such as Medicare and Social Security are as well. Today, most nations throughout the world have some kind of socialism, including the United States, but particularly those in Europe and Asia. Only a few countries have fully socialist economies, including the People's Republic of China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea. Communism. The idea of communism has a long legacy where visions of a communist society can be traced back as far as the 4th century BCE. But why did it turn negatively if it had worked for thousands of years before? Communism is an economic theory that argues for a classless society in which all property and riches are owned collectively rather than individually. It is an ideology that stands in contrast to liberal democracy and capitalism. It argues for a classless economy in which the means of production are communally controlled and private property is non-existent or severely restricted. Communism is an umbrella word for a variety of ideas. Victor Dupay, an 18th century French aristocrat, proposed living in communes where all property would be shared and all may benefit from everybody's work. For much of the 20th century, communist regimes controlled around 1/3 of the world's population. These regimes were distinguished by the control of a single party, which permitted minimal opposition and dissent. In addition, Rather than a capitalist economy in which people compete for profits, party leaders built a command economy in which the state owned property and its bureaucrats set salaries, prices, and production targets. The inefficiencies of these economies contributed significantly to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the surviving communist nations, with the exception of North Korea, are now permitting greater economic competition while maintaining one-party control. There has been significant research into the causes behind communism's downfall, but academics have identified a few common aspects that led to its demise. The first is a lack of motivation for people to generate profit. The monetary motive encourages competition and creativity in society, but an ideal citizen in a communist state is selflessly committed to societal ideals and rarely considers their personal well-being. The second reason communism failed is due to intrinsic inefficiencies in the system, such as centralized planning. This type of planning necessitates the collection and synthesis of massive volumes of data at the micro level. All projects are planned centrally, hence this method of planning is similarly complex. In numerous situations where communism was in full action, growth data was manipulated or inaccurately recorded in order to fit facts into predetermined figures to give a sense of progress. The concentration of power in the hands of a few created inefficiencies and offered incentives for them to cheat the system in order to maintain their position. Corruption and sloth became endemic to this system. Surveillance, such as that seen in East German and Soviet society, was widespread. It also discouraged industrious and hardworking individuals. Ultimately, the economy suffered. Currently, China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam all have major communism values for their government. However, many also follow certain capitalist ideals. They are essentially autocratic and do not adhere to Marx's original conception of the word. Syndicalism. Syndicalism is a groundbreaking direction in the labor movement that seeks to unionize workers by industry and advance their demands through strikes and other forms of direct action, with the ultimate goal of gaining control of the means of production and the economy as a whole through social ownership. Syndicalist unions originally appeared in Spain and North America in the 1870s, then gained popularity in France and spread to other continents. Syndicalist movements dominated the socialist movement throughout the interwar period preceding the onset of World War II. The International Workers' Association, Asociación Internacional de los Trabajadores, founded in 1922, is an international syndicalist organization of labor unions from various nations. At its heyday, it represented millions of workers and battled directly for working-class hearts and minds with social democratic unions and parties. A number of syndicalist groups were and continue to be affiliated with the IWA-AIT. Some of its member organizations departed for the International Confederation of Labor, which was established in 2018. Fascism. Although the term fascist is used widely today, its roots are in a history of very destructive and polarizing European political groups. The political landscape of the European continent was drastically altered by these movements, which emerged in the years between World Wars I and II. What does fascism actually mean then? In simple terms, fascism is a concept of politics in which the state, often under one-man command, dominates all aspects of life, as in Benito Mussolini's Italy and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. In this system of politics, residents are not permitted to talk or do what they like, especially criticizing the decisions of the commanding power. Fascism is often regarded as a mass political movement that prioritizes militarism, radical nationalism, and the nation's superiority over the individual. Liberal democracies that value individual liberties, free and fair elections, and political dissent conflict with this kind of administration. Fascist governments are recognizable in many respects. They support the persecution of political opponents and the overthrow of current political structures. However, in promoting traditional values, these governments are also quite conservative. Furthermore, fascist dictators frequently connect their regimes with major financial interests, despite their claims to protect the average person. Fascist governments foster the idea that its leaders are admirable and deserving of affection. Propaganda and the media frequently support this cult of personality. Mussolini's picture was displayed on classroom walls in Italy, and his political party urged all citizens to buy an annual calendar with a Mussolini theme. Mussolini forbade reporters from covering his age or health problems in order to preserve this potent image. To portray his might, he frequently even went so far as to take pictures of himself riding a horse or posing with a lion. Mussolini, often known as Il Duce, became legendary. The Pope credited supernatural intervention for Il Duce's survival of murder attempts. Fascist and authoritarian regimes are not the same, despite the fact that they both aim to consolidate power, are anti-democratic, and provide minimal space for opposition. The goal of authoritarian regimes is for its subjects to stay demobilized and inactive. Fascist regimes, on the other hand, use avenues set up by the government to encourage popular involvement in society. For example, both Mussolini and Hitler attracted large audiences to rallies meant to generate passion for the nation, the party, and the leader. Hitler and Mussolini came to power quickly, but it took time for their nations to transition from constitutional to fascist rule. Instead, the two nations went through a similar liberal decline trajectory. To gain power, the fascist leaders used these 5 steps. Step 1. Coming out of disappointment. Step 2. Gaining acceptance as a political organization. Step 3. Using right-wing alliances to increase power. Step 4. Dominating institutions with power. Step 5. Putting drastic measures into action. Even if there hasn't been a true fascist movement since World War II, it's nevertheless important to comprehend the phases of fascism. As long as democracy is under threat, it is critical that we understand the conditions that have allowed such destructive regimes to emerge. Anarchism. Anarchism, anarchist, and anarchy are terms derived from the Greek word anarchos, which means without authority, and are used to indicate both support and criticism. Anarchism is a set of ideologies and attitudes based on the notion that government is detrimental and unneeded. Anarchist philosophy originated in the West and expanded over the world, particularly in the early 20th century. They reject man-made rules, see property as a tool for oppression, and think that crime is just the result of property and power. However, they would counter that their rejection of constitutions and governments results not in no justice, but in the true justice inherent in the free growth of human sociality, the natural propensity, when unconstrained by rules, to live according to the principles and practice of mutual help. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French political writer and pioneer socialist, was the first person to openly identify as an anarchist. After World War II, anarchist organizations and federations resurfaced in practically every country where they had previously thrived, with the significant exceptions of Spain and the Soviet Union. The basic anarchist worldview, with its stress on simplicity of existence and the necessity of love and wrath as complementary and necessary components in both societal and individual action, appealed to people who rejected impersonal political structures and older parties' calculations. The anarchist rejection of the state, as well as the emphasis on decentralism and local autonomy, resonated strongly with those who argued for participatory democracy. Some student groups in France, the United States, and Japan advocated for extra-parliamentary activity and physical confrontation, reflecting the anarchist reliance on direct action. Throughout history, authors and artists have been inspired by anarchism's basic ideas of freedom, equality, and mutual help. When anarchism emerged as an organized organization in the mid-19th century, its supporters credited a large number of well-known literary and artistic giants as forerunners and allies. Many famous 20th century artists, including Pablo Picasso, Francis Picabia, and the Czech-born Marie Cherminowa, known as Toyen, were either engaged in the anarchist movement or acknowledged it as a key influence. Cartoons, which had always been important weapons in the anarchist armory, were more prevalent than ever in the movement's press at the close of the 20th century. Nationalism. Nationalism is a concept or movement that maintains that the country should be consistent with the state. As a movement, it implies the presence and tends to advocate the interests of a specific nation, especially with the objective of achieving and retaining its sovereignty or self-governance over its imagined homeland to form a nation-state. It believes that each country should rule itself without outside intervention or self-determination, that a nation is the natural and ideal foundation for a polity, and that the nation is the only legitimate source of political authority. Because of its dynamic vitality and all-pervading character, nationalism is sometimes mistakenly regarded as a permanent factor in political behavior. In fact, the American and French revolutions may be considered its first powerful manifestations. Nationalism is a modern movement. Throughout history, people have been attached to their native soil, to their parents' traditions, and to established territorial authorities. However, it wasn't until the end of the 18th century that nationalism began to be a widely recognized sentiment molding public and private life, and one of the great, if not the greatest, single determining factors of modern history. After influencing the new countries of Latin America, it expanded in the early 19th century to Central Europe, and from there, during the middle of the century, to Eastern and Southeastern Europe. At the beginning of the 20th century, nationalism flourished across Asia and Africa. Thus, the 19th century was known as the era of nationalism in Europe, but the 20th century saw the birth and battle of significant national movements in Asia and Africa. Critics of nationalism claim that it is sometimes unclear what makes a nation, or if a nation is a viable unit of political control. Nationalists believe that the borders of a country and a state should coincide. Hence, nationalism tends to reject diversity. It may also spark violence when many national groups claim claims to a certain region or strive to seize control of the state. Critics argue that nationalism is inherently divisive, since supporters may draw on and exaggerate perceived distinctions between people, highlighting an individual's affiliation with their own nation. They also see the concept as potentially repressive, since it may submerge individual identity within a national totality, giving elites or political leaders opportunity to influence or control the populace. Much of the initial criticism of nationalism stemmed from its geopolitical aim of a distinct state for each country. The classic nationalist movements of the 19th century questioned the mere existence of Europe's multi-ethnic empires, contradicting an intellectual criticism of nationalism that evolved into various kinds of internationalism and anti-nationalism. The liberal political tradition viewed nationalism as a hazardous force that caused strife and bloodshed between nation-states. Environmentalism. Environmentalism is a political and social philosophy that seeks to safeguard the natural environment and promote sustainable living in order to secure the well-being of all living things. It highlights the interdependence of people, ecosystems, and the world. In essence, just as the name suggests, it is about preserving the Earth for present and future generations. Environmentalism is fundamentally about advocating for policies, behaviors, and lifestyles that limit environmental damage. This worldview is based on the concept that humans have a moral obligation to respect and safeguard the Earth, its ecosystems, and its limited resources. Moreover, it encompasses both local and global activities, ranging from endangered species conservation to climate change mitigation. Ecologism is more generally used in continental European languages, whereas environmentalism is more commonly used in English. However, the two terms have somewhat distinct meanings. When talking about the origins, the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries, which embraced nature's beauty and inherent value, served as the stepping stone for environmentalism. Writers and intellectuals such as Henry David Thoreau and John Muir stressed the spiritual and aesthetic value of wilderness. As the conservation movement gathered more popularity in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially in the United States, leaders such as Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot emerged. They advocated for national parks and sustainable resource management. The Industrial Revolution caused severe environmental damage, including dirty rivers and smog-filled towns. In response, early environmental movements arose to address concerns such as deforestation, urban sanitation, and wildlife conservation. Core principles in environmentalism include sustainability, conservation of nature, pollution reduction, climate action, social justice, and interconnectedness with Mother Earth. Environmentalists believe in the ethical use of resources to fulfill current demands while preserving future generations' capacity to meet their own. This idea drives projects such as renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and environmentally friendly urban development. Protecting natural ecosystems, animals, and biodiversity is a primary priority. Conservation initiatives vary from maintaining forests and wetlands to establishing national parks and marine reserves. Climate change is a major concern for modern environmentalists. This includes pushing for legislation to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, switch to renewable energy, and adapt to climate change. Environmental justice emphasizes the disproportionate impact of environmental deterioration on vulnerable groups. This concept then connects environmentalism to larger social movements that advocate for equality and fairness. On the other hand, a new idea gained momentum in the late 20th century called anti-environmentalism. It refers to a collection of views and behaviors that reject environmentalism in general, as well as specific environmental policies or programs. Theocracy. Theocracy is a type of autocracy or oligarchy in which one or more deities are acknowledged as supreme ruling authority, providing divine direction to human mediators wielding executive and legislative power and managing the government's everyday operations. The word theocracy comes from the ancient Greek theokratia, which means the rule of God. Flavius Josephus originally used the phrase in the 1st century AD to characterize the Jewish government's unique characteristics. While humans had produced various systems of government, Josephus maintained that the majority of them could be classified into 3 categories: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. However, Josephus claimed that the Jewish government was exceptional. Josephus used the term theocracy to characterize a society in which a deity was sovereign and his word was law. The typical general usage of the term, as defined above in terms of governance by a church or equivalent religious leadership, may be more correctly described as an ecclesiocracy. In an ecclesiocracy, religious leaders play a key role in the state but do not profess to be vehicles of divine revelation. A comparable occurrence is a secular government coexisting with a state religion or delegating some areas of civil law to religious communities. In Israel, for example, marriage is administered by legally authorized religious groups, each of which provides marriage services to their respected believers. Yet, no form of civil marriage free of religion exists, nor is marriage by non-recognized minority religions permitted. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Vatican are examples of modern-day theocracies. Corporatism. Corporatism is a political system of interest representation and policymaking in which corporate groupings, such as agricultural, labor, military, economic, scientific, or guild associations, work together to negotiate contracts or policies based on their shared interests. The name is derived from the Latin corpus, which means body. Corporatism does not relate to a political system dominated by huge economic interests, despite the fact that the latter are frequently referred to as corporations in current American vernacular and legal terminology. The right phrase for that theoretical framework is corporatocracy. The terms corporatocracy and corporatism are sometimes misconstrued since they have similar names and companies are utilized as governmental organs. Corporatism emerged in the 1850s as a response to the growth of classic liberalism and Marxism, and it supported class collaboration rather than class strife. Corporatist models have been supported by adherents of various ideologies, including economic liberalism, fascism, and social democracy. Corporatism became a central concept of Italian fascism, and Benito Mussolini's fascist dictatorship in Italy supported the complete integration of disparate interests into the state for the common good. However, the more democratic neo-corporatism frequently supported tripartism. Democracy. One of the widely known political ideologies is definitely democracy. A basic definition of democracy states that rulers are elected in competitive elections, but more broad definitions include guarantees of civil freedoms and human rights in addition to competitive elections. In a direct democracy, the people have direct authority to debate and pass laws. In a representational democracy, citizens elect government leaders. The notion of the people and how authority is shared or transferred by them have evolved over time and at differing speeds among countries. Democracy frequently includes freedom of assembly, association, personal property, religion and speech, citizenship, consent of the governed, voting rights, freedom from unjustified state denial to the right to life and liberty, and minority rights. Throughout history, there is evidence of direct democracy, in which communities make choices through public assemblies. Today, the main type of democracy is representational democracy, in which individuals elect government officials to govern on their behalf, such as in a parliamentary or presidential system. Most democracies use the majority rule. However, in certain circumstances, the plurality, supermajority, or consensus rules are used. They serve the critical function of inclusion and greater legitimacy on sensitive issues, counterbalancing majoritarianism, and hence often take precedence at the constitutional level.